Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. 2 years ago, at the opening of Central Rizal here in Kuala Lumpur, I described José Rizal as a great Filipino, a great Malay, and a great Southeast Asian. Today, on this auspicious occasion, I would like to go further. The question before us is neither why Rizal mattered in the 19th century, nor should our task be merely to preserve his memory. The more pivotal question is, what does it mean to take Rizal seriously in Southeast Asia today? If Rizal is to remain vibrant, a living intellectual presence, rather than merely a historical personality, then we must be prepared to bring his ideas into conversation with the circumstances of our own age. And when we do so, what is remarkable is how familiar some of the fundamental questions remain. Sovereignty and domination, asymmetrical power, national identity. What do they really mean? How do these questions stack up against other crucial imperatives? Political accountability, education, economic opportunity, and the dynamics between reform and resistance. Ladies and gentlemen, to understand why Rizal still matters, we should first remind ourselves of the extraordinary circumstances into which he came into the world. When José Rizal was born, the Philippines had already been under the yoke of Spanish rule for more than 3 centuries. By the time he was martyred on 30th December 1896, when he uttered the haunting words of Christ, "Consummatum est," he was only 35 years old. Here, I recall the famous lines of Hotspur in Henry IV, Part 1. And I quote, "Oh gentlemen, the time of life is short. To spend that shortness basely were too long," unquote. Indeed, true to that calling, in that short life, Rizal achieved what to many of us might be well nigh impossible, and if indeed possible, would have taken generations. Ophthalmologist, eloquent writer, inspiring educator, amazing polyglot, astute political thinker, and cardinal figure in the shaping of the nation's ethos, character, and identity. Rizal was deeply Filipino in his political purpose, but profoundly international in his intellectual outlook. And that combination is vital because Rizal reminds us that national consciousness and international engagement are not diametrically opposed, nor is it what we call a zero-sum equation. On the contrary, in international relations, a strong sense of identity provides a nation with greater confidence in dealing with the external world. This matters particularly in Southeast Asia, which till today bears the imprint of colonialism. Even then, Rizal understood the intellectual dimension of this problem remarkably well. When he annotated Antonio de Mora's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, Dr. Rizal wanted Filipinos to understand that their very own civilization, their commerce, their political life did not begin with colonial rule. It was an intellectual act of emancipation, an attempt to return historical agency to a colonized people. In post-colonial Southeast Asia today, this principle still resonates. A nation that does not understand its own history risks understanding itself only through lenses seen and narratives written by others. Across Rizal's wider body of work lies an even harder question. What enables a people to become a nation capable of governing itself? His answer was never simply political independence. Freedom required education, institutions, civic responsibility, and citizens capable of exercising independent judgment. We see this conviction very clearly in Rizal's sa mga kababayan dalaga sa Malolos. Namely, that is his famous 1889 letter to the women of Malolos. Their determination to establish a school. For Rizal, education was integral to emancipation because it developed the ability to reason, to question, and ultimately to exercise judgment. A society incapable of thinking critically is vulnerable, and a society that cannot distinguish argument from propaganda or knowledge from manipulation can find its sovereignty compromised. The same principle applies to institutions. When Dr. Rizal founded La Liga Filipina in July 1892, the objectives went well beyond opposition to colonial authority. It sought to unite the country, protect people against injustice, and encourage education, agriculture, commerce, and social reform. This tells us something fundamental about his political philosophy. Simply replacing one set of rulers with another would not constitute genuine emancipation. Freedom required capable institutions, civic organization, and economic progress. Meaningful sovereignty requires capable institutions, social cohesion, economic resilience, educated citizens, and governments that command legitimacy. Ladies and gentlemen, while the political world that Rizal inhabited was radically different from ours, the underlying problems are familiar. How does a society preserve its dignity when confronted by overwhelming power? How does a nation exercise political agency when decisions affecting its future may be shaped by forces much larger than itself? And how do we overcome domination without allowing resistance itself to become a weapon of self-destruction? These questions are central to Southeast Asia today. We live in a region increasingly shaped by competition among major powers, not the least China and the United States. But ASEAN's task is not to choose one or the other to determine our future. Our task is to retain the agency to determine that future ourselves. I say this in the earnest belief that there is something profoundly resilient in that aspiration. Engage everybody, learn from everybody, and cooperate wherever cooperation is essential. But do not surrender your capacity to determine your own future. If Rizal were here today, respectfully, I would imagine him saying, that indeed is a nation's birthright. Dr. Rizal was undoubtedly a Filipino nationalist, but to interpret his nationalism narrowly would be to do injustice to his universal appeal. Nationalism need not mean isolationism. It can instead provide the foundation from which international engagement begins, from a position of self-respect and political agency. ASEAN itself demonstrates this. The founding fathers of ASEAN did not abandon sovereignty when they came together in 1967. The attachment to sovereignty was precisely one of the reasons regional cooperation became necessary. They understood that preserving national autonomy could sometimes require collective action. And from 5 founding members came an organization encompassing the region and eventually an ASEAN community. Ladies and gentlemen, Rizal fought oppression primarily through ideas and persuasion. His novels expose misgovernment and injustice to audiences far beyond the Philippines. In the semantics of geopolitics today, we call that the exercise of soft power. Indeed, he was one of the most consequential Southeast Asian intellectuals to internationalize the grievances of a colonized people through literature, through scholarship, and through transnational correspondence. The Spanish authorities eventually realized the power of his pen because they knew that an idea, once encaged, is well nigh impossible to incarcerate. There is something particularly striking about this in our own age. Information now travels instantaneously, narrative cross borders before governments can respond, and social media can mobilize societies, expose injustice, distort reality, and manufacture outrage, sometimes simultaneously. Power, therefore, resides not only in armies, economies, or technology, but also in the ability to persuade, to tell one's story, and to define the terms of debate. Dr. Rizal understood the politics of narrative more than a century before the digital age. But he also understood its dangers. El filibusterismo confronts us with an uncomfortable question. What happens when legitimate aspirations of reform are transformed by prostration into vengeance and violence? Rizal was no apologist for injustice, but he remained deeply concerned about what would replace an unjust order. Political liberation without education, institutions, and civic responsibility could well unleash the Pandora's box of the very pathologies it sought to destroy. This tension between reform and revolution remains one of the most fascinating aspects of Rizal's political thought, and it remains relevant to the governance of our states today. This is why national security cannot be reduced simply to deterrence, military capability, or internal security laws. Good governance, inclusion, development, accountability, and legitimacy are themselves components of national security. A state may possess formidable instruments of coercion and remains fundamentally insecure if its institutions lose the confidence of the people. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning's ceremony therefore carries a significance beyond the conferment of an honors. The history of the Knights of Rizal itself began with an act of remembrance when admirers of Rizal gathered in 1911 to commemorate his martyrdom. More than a century later, that responsibility has traveled beyond the Philippines, including here to Malaysia, where this chapter was established last year. Rizal's intellectual legacy belongs not only to Philippine history, but to a wider Southeast Asian conversation. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden, and so intones T.S. Eliot in Burnt Northern. But not here in the case of José Rizal, for we are encountering his lived experience, and the memory is still green. Yet, institutions devoted to historical figures face a particular responsibility to preserve memory without allowing memory to become merely ceremonial. The greatest tribute we can pay Rizal is not simply to admire him, but to engage him, to read him, argue with him, apply his ideas to our own circumstances, and occasionally allow ourselves to be made uncomfortable by the answers. Rizal did not like to norem in tangere so that future generations would only place it reverentially on a shelf. He wrote it because he wanted people to see, to think, to question, and ultimately to act. And this is why the educational mission of the Knights of Rizal matters, particularly for our younger generations. They inhabit a world which Rizal could scarcely have imagined technologically, but one whose fundamental political and moral dilemmas he would have recognized immediately. Who possesses power? Who holds that power accountable? What makes a nation genuinely free? How should the weak deal with the strong? And what obligations accompany freedom? When I spoke about Rizal 2 years ago, I recalled how his spirit continues to soar across the seas from the Philippines to Malaysia and beyond. Today, I would add that perhaps What traveled across those areas was never merely the memory of a man. It was also an idea of Southeast Asia itself, a region confident enough to draw upon its intellectual traditions, open to the world, but secure in its identity, and capable of cooperating with great powers without becoming subordinate for them. Rizal never lived to see an independent Philippines, and he certainly never lived to see ASEAN. But I believe he would recognize the fundamental aspiration behind both. A people claiming the right to exercise agency over their own future. And that ultimately is why José Rizal, Dr. José Rizal, matters not because the world has remained the same since 1896, but because it has changed so dramatically while leaving some of the most fundamental questions unresolved. So to the Knights being recognized today, and to the members of this Malaysia chapter, I offer my heartiest congratulations. Wear the honor proudly, keep Rizal's memory alive, and let his ideas resonate in universities, public debates, in conversations between Malaysians and Filipinos, and in the wider intellectual life of ASEAN. Rizal demonstrated that a man armed principally with intellect, courage, and a pen could awaken the consciousness of a nation. Today, it is on us to ensure that the consciousness he helped awaken continues to illuminate the region he called home. Muli, isang karangalan sa akin ang magbahagi ng salita sa inyong lahat. Hanggang sa muli nating pagkikita. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay tayong lahat. Thank you very much.
Thank you for